Montana Territory, late spring 1871, the wind whipped through the high grass as the stagecoach pulled away, leaving a trail of dust and one woman standing alone at the edge of the Miles City Depot platform. Vera Gable clutched her worn carpetbag to her chest, boots planted in the dry dirt, her eyes burning from more than just the wind. Her brother had promised the debt was small. Handled, he had said in his last letter. But when she arrived home from her teaching job in Ohio, she had found the house gone, the furniture taken, and a man with yellow teeth and a legal paper telling her that her brother had lost everything in a poker game, including her name. "His debt, your burden now," the man had said, laughing as he handed her a train ticket west. He signed over guardianship. "You are property now, get on the train," and she did, because what choice did she have? Now she stood in a territory she had only read about, with prairie wind biting through her thin shawl and a ledge of grief pressing behind her eyes. She had not cried, not when they sold her mother's piano, not when she watched her brother ride away, not when they made her sign that paper. But now, alone with nowhere to go and no one waiting, the tears came. She turned her back to the platform and stepped down into the grass, wiping at her face. She did not want to be seen like this, but someone already had a voice low and steady. "You all right, miss?" Vera startled and spun. A man was leaning against the hitch rail beside a chestnut gelding, hat set low, arms crossed. He had that lean, sun-browned look of someone who lived under the sky. His coat was dusted from the trail and his boots were cracked at the toes. But it was his eyes that caught her, quiet, watchful, not prying, just seeing. "I am fine," Vera said quickly, turning her face away. "Please, I do not need help." "I reckon you do," he said gently. "You got off that stage with no welcome party and no wagon. That was the last run of the day. You got nowhere to go. I will manage. You are crying." She clenched her jaw. "I am not." He did not argue. He stepped forward slow, like he figured sudden movement might scare her off. "Name's Kade Rowley. I run a cattle spread about 10 miles north. You can see the dust line over that ridge. That is where my boys are moving the spring drive. I came down to collect supplies." Vera didn't answer. Kade nodded toward her bag. "You got family here?" "No." "You got work lined up?" "No." "You got a place to sleep tonight?" She hesitated. "I did not think so," he said. "There is a bunkhouse at my ranch. It is nothing fancy, but it is dry and the cook makes decent stew. I will ride you up there. You can sleep, eat, figure out what you want next. I do not know you, and I do not know you. But I saw you cry and I do not walk away from that. You want me to bring the sheriff over and we can talk to him together? Or you want to ride out and see the sky from my porch and decide for yourself if I am worth trusting?" Vera stared at him. Her instincts screamed to run, to hide, to keep her pride. But pride had not kept her warm on that train, and his voice was not smooth like a liar's. It was quiet, real. She nodded once. He led the horse over and swung up, then reached a hand down. "You ride?" "Not well. I will hold steady." She let him pull her up behind him, her hands gripping the saddle horn pressed against a stranger's back. She felt his warmth, the steady rise and fall of his breath. They rode out past the depot, the sun dipping low behind the hills. The wind was sharp, but the silence between them was not heavy. She did not cry again. She just watched the way the land opened up, wide and wild. By the time they reached the ranch house, she was half asleep. He helped her down, guided her inside. The bunkhouse smelled of wood smoke and stew. No sharp voices, just the low murmur of men and the clatter of dishes. "Cook's name is Harv," Kade said. "He will get you fed. You can sleep in the extra room off the kitchen. Has a door that locks." "Thank you," she whispered. He met her eyes. "You are safe here." She believed him. The next morning, Vera woke to sunlight on her face and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, heart pounding at first, unsure where she was. Then she remembered the ride, the bunkhouse, the way Kade had looked at her like she was still a person and not just a piece of paper signed away. She washed her face in the basin, dressed, and stepped outside. Kade was leaning on the porch rail, sipping coffee. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Yes." "Thank you." He studied her a moment. "You want to tell me what sent you west?" She looked away. "My brother. He gambled with the wrong men, lost everything, including me." Kade's jaw worked. "He sold you, in a way." He nodded slowly. "You are not owned here, not by me." Not by anyone. She looked up at him. Why are you helping me? Because I saw your tears. He said it like that was reason enough. In the days that followed, Vera learned the rhythm of the place. She helped in the kitchen, read by the fire at night, kept her hands busy. Harv grumbled but let her take over baking. Kade stayed mostly out on the range, but he came in every evening. He always found her first. He asked about her teaching back east. She asked about ranching. He laughed quietly when she burned the cornbread. She teased him when he tracked mud through the kitchen, and slowly she began to feel steady again. One evening, she stood on the porch watching the sun dip low. Kade stepped up beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I have been thinking," he said. "You ever consider staying?" She turned toward him. "Why?" "Because you belong here more than you think. You work hard. You are kind. You look at this land like it is waking you up." "And what do you want, Kade?" He looked at her then, really looked. "I want you to know that you were never someone's loss. You are a choice. Mine if you will have me." Vera's breath caught. She reached for his hand. "I will," she said, and he smiled just once, but it lit his whole face. By mid-June, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out thick and full, their branches swaying above the water like slow dancers. The air was warmer now, though the mornings still held a chill that nipped at fingertips and made the breath rise pale in the early light. Vera stood near the wash line behind the ranch house, clothespins clenched between her teeth as she shook out a damp shirt. Her hands moved without thought, but her eyes stayed fixed on the distant rise where the hills folded into one another, brushy and golden in the sunshine. She'd begun to memorize the land's lines like pages from a book. Its shape comforted her. Kade rode in from the North Trail just past midday, his shirt damp at the collar and a streak of dust cutting across his cheek. He dismounted without hurry, leading the horse to the rail and giving its neck a long stroke before turning toward her. "You ever handle a branding iron?" he asked, eyes shaded beneath the brim of his hat. She wiped her hands on her apron. "No, but I've mended enough burns to know what it can do." He stepped up beside her, not too close, the way he always did, never crowding, always steady. "We're marking the last of the spring calves this week. Might be good for you to see if you're thinking of staying through summer. I haven't made up my mind, I know. Still, you ought to see what keeps us busy." She followed him out past the corral to the lower pasture, where 3 ranch hands were guiding bawling calves into a wooden chute. A 4th man, young and red-faced, pressed a hot iron to a calf's flank. The scent of singed hair drifted on the wind. "They don't forget pain," Vera said quietly. Kade nodded. "Neither do people." She looked over at him, his profile sharp in the sunlight. "Did you? I remember every piece of it, but I don't carry it the same." She didn't ask what he meant. The way his voice bent around the words, something in her knew it wasn't the kind of pain that could be named in a sentence, and she wasn't yet ready to trade stories of what had broken them. Later that evening, she sat on the porch steps with a pan of peas in her lap, shelling them into a tin bowl. Kade came around the corner carrying a length of rope, his shirt clean but wrinkled, his boots newly brushed. He hesitated before sitting on the step below her, resting his forearms on his knees. "Harv said you've been reorganizing the pantry. It was a mess. You couldn't find salt without knocking over sugar. He's still grumbling about it. He'll survive." He chuckled low. "You like putting things in order. I like knowing where things stand." He nodded, fingers twisting the rope absently. "When I was 12, my father got kicked by a mule and never walked again. My mother took in laundry for soldiers at Fort Keogh. I ran fence lines instead of going to school. There was no order in it, just survival." She watched the way his hands moved slow, practiced, making loops without looking. "Is that why you built this place?" His eyes lifted to hers. "It's the only thing I ever made that stayed put." Vera reached for another pea pod, fingers brushing the bowl's rim. "I used to think home was tied to walls, furniture, familiar streets. I don't know anymore. You don't have to decide today. I know. But it's getting harder to picture leaving." Kade said nothing, just leaned back on his elbows and looked out across the pasture, where the sky had begun to stain orange at the edges. The silence between them was easy now, not something to fill. She set the bowl aside and drew her knees up, resting her chin there. "What happens when summer ends? We take the herd across the Yellowstone, sell off the steers before the snow sets in. And after that, I winter here. The hands go home. I stay to mend what's broken, fix what the cold will test. She turned her face toward him. That sounds lonely. It used to be. They didn't speak again until the sun was nearly down and the last of the birds had gone quiet. When Kade finally stood, he held out a hand not to lift her, just to steady her. She took it without thinking. As their fingers met, something shifted. Not a spark, not heat, but something deeper, recognition maybe, a quiet knowing. He didn't let go until she was on her feet. "You're not what I expected," she said. He smiled, small and soft. "Neither are you." They went inside together, side by side, and the door closed behind them without a sound. The rains came in late June, sudden and hard, flattening the ryegrass and turning the trail ruts into narrow creeks. The roof over the porch held, though a steady drip tapped from one warped shingle above the step. Kade made note to mend it when the sun returned. Inside, the kitchen windows fogged with steam as Vera stirred a pot of barley and carrots. The air smelled of thyme and wood smoke, and the floor beneath her boots was warm from the fire Harv had stoked at dawn. She hummed low under her breath, not a tune she knew, just something that settled in her chest and asked to be let out. Kade leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching her with a quiet that never pushed. After a moment, he spoke without raising his voice. "You always make noise when you cook." She glanced over her shoulder, half smiling. "I think better when my hands are busy." He stepped in, boots soft on the plank floor. "You've been thinking a lot lately." "I have." He waited. "I got a letter this morning," she said. "Came with the supply wagon from a friend of my father's in Columbus." Kade stayed still. "He offering you something, a position at a girls' school, small but proper, board, salary, a classroom with real desks." She stirred the pot slowly, her eyes on the steam. "He knew I'd lost my post back east after everything. You thinking of taking it?" "I was." For a minute, he said nothing, just moved to the table and sat, hands resting open on the wood. "I used to think teaching was the only thing that made me useful," she went on, voice low. "It was the one thing I could control." "Knowledge doesn't gamble or lie or disappear in the night." Kade didn't interrupt. The only sound was the slow bubble of the stew. "But it's not the only way to live," she said. "And maybe usefulness isn't the same as meaning." He looked up then, and the question in his eyes wasn't about the school. Vera turned from the stove and faced him fully. "Out there, I'd be safe, but I'd be alone, and here there's no guarantees." "But there's you." Kade stood, slow but sure, as if any sudden movement might shift something delicate. "I don't want to hold you here," he said. "Not with obligation, not with gratitude." "I'm not grateful," she said, and then her mouth softened. "I'm choosing." Rain tapped harder on the roof, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet. He stepped close enough that she could see the pale scar above his brow, the one that curved like a question mark. He didn't reach for her. He waited. She moved first. Her fingers touched his collar, then slid up to rest against the stubble along his jaw. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but I want to find out here." His hand came up to cover hers, rough, warm, steady. "We'll build it," he said. "Whatever it is." Later, when the stew had cooled and the fire had burned down to coals, Vera stood at the window, watching the clouds break apart over the hills. The light was faint, but it reached the far fence line where the wet earth gleamed. Kade came up behind her, wrapping her shawl over her shoulders before she could ask for it. She leaned back against him, her voice quiet. "I want to plant something." He rested his chin above her ear. "You tell me what, and I'll break the ground. Peas, maybe, and beans. Things that root deep." He smiled into her hair. "That sounds about right." Neither of them spoke again. They just stood there, watching the rain ease into mist and the world outside begin to shine. The first frost came early that year. It settled quiet and pale over the pasture, whitening fence rails and stiffening the creek's muddy edge. Vera woke before the others, wrapped herself in Kade's spare coat, and stepped out into the crisp morning. Her breath clouded in front of her. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and snorted. She walked the narrow path to the root cellar, basket on her arm, her boots crunching over the frozen grass. She'd started keeping extra stores: turnips, beans, dried apples marking shelves with neat chalk lines. There was comfort in knowing what they had, what they could count on. The cellar door creaked open. She ducked inside, the cold earth smell curling around her, and began sorting through the crates. A few minutes later, she heard the door above lift again. "You don't sleep past dawn anymore," Kade said, boots scuffing the steps as he came down. "Neither do you." She didn't turn, only kept checking for soft spots in the potatoes. He crouched beside her, a burlap sack in one hand. "Harv says you've got him pickling onions now. I told him it'd keep his hands busy." He grumbled, but he listened. "He listens to you more than he ever did me." Vera straightened, brushing her palms against her skirt. "You didn't come down here to talk about onions." He looked up at her then, the lantern light behind him catching in his eyes. "I've been thinking about the land east of the creek. It's flat enough to take seed. Could put up a second house there if we wanted." She studied him. "Why would we need a second house?" "Because this one's mine," he said carefully. "And if you're staying, I'd like to build one that's yours too." "Ours?" Her fingers curled around the basket's handle. "You mean a marriage?" "I mean a life," he said. "With you if you'll have it." The air in the cellar was still. No sound but their breath, the soft crackle of frost melting overhead. "I never pictured a wedding with dirt under my nails and hands full of potatoes," she said. Kade's mouth lifted, not quite a grin, just warm. "We can wait till spring, or not at all. I'd stand in the creek barefoot if that's what you wanted." She set the basket down, stepped closer. "I want the truth, that's all. A man who doesn't walk away when things break." "You already have that," he said quietly. She touched his cheek, thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. "Then yes." He didn't kiss her, not yet. Just rested his forehead to hers, his hand against the small of her back. They stayed that way for a long time, the cellar still around them, the weight of the world held off by the closeness of two people who had chosen each other not for what they'd lost, but for what they could build. When they came up, the frost had begun to melt, and the sun tipped over the ridge, warming the roof of the house that would soon be theirs. The snow came in mid-November, early and deep. It fell through the dusk without wind, blanketing the hills, the barn roof, the empty corral rails. The cattle were already winter-penned, hay stacked high against the stall walls. Vera watched from the kitchen window as the last light sank behind the ridge, her hands busy shaping dough into small rounds beside a bowl of lard and flour. Kade came in from the barn with his coat stiff from the cold and a red flush on his ears. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his hat, then crossed to the stove without a word, holding his hands out to the warmth. "You didn't wear the wool gloves," Vera said without looking up. "They're too short in the fingers. I can fix that." He leaned his hip against the counter, watching the way she pinched the dough closed. "You fix a lot of things." She met his eyes then. "Not everything stays fixed, and still you try." The dough was ready. She laid the rounds on a cloth-lined tin and covered them. "Why do you say it like that's a surprise?" "Because it's not what most folks would do, given what you've come through." "I'm not most folks." "No," he murmured. "You're not." Later, after the meal and the dishes and the soft hush of the house settling into night, they sat across from one another at the hearth. The fire threw long shadows on the log walls. Kade had brought out an iron kettle and a pair of tin mugs, the kind used in colder months for boiled root tea laced with honey and clove. Vera curled her fingers around her mug but didn't drink, eyes on the fire. "I keep thinking about my mother's silver comb," she said. "I wrapped it in cloth before I left Ohio. It was the only thing I kept from her, but somewhere between the depot and here it vanished." He didn't ask why it mattered. He only said, "You want me to ride back and ask after it?" She shook her head slowly. "No, it's not about the object. It's the idea that I could carry something of hers forward, but maybe I don't need a thing to do that." "You've carried her in other ways," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. "I don't know if I ever told you how she used to sit with me during storms. She'd make a cup of milk with cinnamon and sing under her breath, and I'd stop shaking." "You don't shake now," he said gently. "No," she said, "but sometimes I still feel the ghosts of it." He set his mug down and reached for her hand. "You've got a place now. And no ghosts live here unless we let them." The fire popped, a log collapsing inward. "What would you have done?" she asked. "If I'd left for Columbus?" "I would have let you go," he said. "And then I'd have spent the rest of my life wishing I'd asked you to stay." She didn't speak. Just set her mug aside and leaned in, her head against his chest, listening to the quiet thump of his heart beneath the soft wool of his shirt. His arm came around her, slow and sure. "I never imagined I'd want to stay still," she whispered. "But now I can't imagine leaving." They stayed that way until the fire burned low and the wind outside picked up, brushing against the windows like a memory trying to get in. By spring, the second house had begun to rise, each board laid by Kade's hand, each window frame shaped with care. Vera planted rows of peas and corn beside it, her hands in the soil, her hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. She wore a wedding band now plain, gold, and warm from her skin, and Kade wore its match, though it often bore the nicks of fence wire and hammerwork. They were married in February, just past the thaw, with Harv as witness and the ranch hands standing in a loose half-circle under the cottonwoods. There were no flowers, just snowmelt dripping from the branches and the sound of birds returning. Vera wore a dress dyed soft blue from boiled indigo scrap, and Kade hadn't stopped looking at her since she'd stepped from the front door. He'd taken her hand and said only, "You're home now," and she was, their days settled into a rhythm. She taught the ranch boys to read in the evenings, seated at the table with oil lamps lit and a slate board leaning against her chair. Kade worked the cattle and fixed what needed fixing, but he always came in by dusk, always left his boots by the door and kissed her temple before washing up. By midsummer, the garden had filled in thick with beans, squash, and tall stalks of rye. Vera moved easily through the rows, a basket on her arm, her eyes bright and steady. She sang sometimes now, real tunes, ones she remembered from childhood, and the sound of it threaded through the air like thread through cloth. One night, just after the last hay had been stacked in the loft, Kade brought her out to the porch and handed her a small parcel wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it slowly and stared down. The silver comb lay nestled in the folds, dull from age but whole. "I found it," he said quietly. "Buried in the bottom of that carpet bag you came with. I'd forgotten we stored it in the attic." Her throat tightened. "You kept that old bag, didn't want to throw away the thing that brought you here." She reached for his hand, the comb resting in her palm like something sacred. "I don't need it to carry her. But I'm glad to have it back." They stood there as the sky darkened, the stars coming out one by one like lanterns lit in distant windows, and when he turned to her, hand resting at her waist, she rose up and kissed him full, slow, certain. They built a life that way, quiet, steady, rooted deep in the land and in each other. Through harsh winters and dry summers, through the birth of calves and the loss of old horses, through letters from back east that she no longer answered and meals eaten shoulder to shoulder with the men who now called her boss as much as they did Kade, she never left again. And he never stopped choosing her. Every morning, every dusk, in the end, the house they'd built together stood strong beside the garden, the porch worn smooth by years of footsteps, and the laughter inside it rang long into each season. And the land they'd once stood on, as strangers grew into soil that remembered them as family.